Well, we don't believe anything you say. Well, where have we gone wrong in our discussion of the evidence? And they can't say anything about where we've gone wrong. So watch this testimony of a young girl who examined the evidence and chose Jesus. The answer, the question on this program is Jesus or Muhammad. We'll watch this testimony about a young girl who answered that question after careful investigation and answered Jesus.
About how the Lord found me and why I am a Christian today. I was introduced to the gospel in my sophomore year of high school by a teacher, actually. My friend Mallory and I were in class, and she turns to him, and I guess she knew he was a Christian, but I had no idea. So she turns to him and asks him, hey, if I do drugs and go to parties and do whatever I want for my whole life, can I just get into heaven? And so my teacher, he goes on this whole spiel, and I'm listening to him speak, and I'm like, wow, I've never heard these things before. So then I go to basketball practice, and the weekend passes by, and whatever he said, I really, to this day, I don't even remember what he said, but whatever he said was constantly on my mind. So I went to him the next week, and I was like, hey, whatever you said, I mean, it's really bugging me. It's on my mind. It's been on my mind for a while. So he turns to me and says, you know, me and my wife have been praying for you for a certain amount of time. And I was shocked, but I was also confused because I didn't understand why he was praying for me. I was like, I'm not sick. I'm totally fine. Like, you don't need to pray for me. But then he tells me to go on BibleGateway.com. And so I'm like, what? What's the Bible Gateway? So I go to BibleGateway.com. And he tells me to look up Romans 8. So I do, and I look up Romans 8, and I even typed it in wrong. I look up Romans 8, and it's all about, you know, walking in the Spirit and avoiding your flesh, and if Christ chooses to dwell in you, He will dwell in you. And I was so confused. I was like, what is the flesh? What is walking in the Spirit? I mean, how do you know if Christ chooses to dwell in you? Like, what? That's not fair, you know? And so I just had all these questions, and I was really confused. But then I turned to him as if to say, okay, whatever, like, why did you have me read this? So then he asked me if I've ever read my Quran, and I look at him and I say, yeah, I mean, I've read it before, but I'm not supposed to read it because you're not supposed to read translations, and I don't speak Arabic, I speak Farsi. And so you're just not supposed to read it in another language other than Arabic. So he goes, well, why don't you just try reading it again so you know what it actually says? And I'm like, why not? Why not sit down and, you know, read what I believe in, what I pray 5 times a day for? So I go back home and I bust out my Quran and I start reading it. And by this time I was a little bit older than the other times I was reading it. So I definitely got a different feel for it. And I definitely started reading it with, you know, just with understanding, and I just understood what I was reading. And so as I was reading, I started noticing verses that I've never noticed before. I started noticing verses about, you know, how men can beat their wives, and I started noticing other verses about just the violence and how I can't have Christians or Jewish friends, and I started noticing all these things, and I was wondering, like, is there an explanation for these verses? So I go to the hadiths and I look at the sunnah, I look at what I believe in, and it supports the claims that are in the Quran. So I just had all these questions running through my mind as to why I've never noticed these before and why the Ummah never told me about this before. And so I go back to him weeks later and I'm like, hey, can I have a Bible? I don't want to be a Christian. I just want to see what you believe in. But to be honest, my intention was not to seek out the Lord or to find truth. I really honestly just wanted to see what, quote unquote, Americans believed in. I found out later that was kind of foolish to think of. But, and so yeah, so he gives me the Bible and he's like, why don't you turn and read the Gospels? And I'm like, what is the Gospel? So he's like, why don't you read Matthew? And I'm like, where is Matthew? And he's like, it's in the New Testament. And I'm like, what? So he pulls it out and he turns to the New Testament and I see the Gospel of Matthew in front of me and I'm like, why is there an Old Testament and a New Testament? Why are there 2 books in 1 book? That doesn't make any sense. Why are there 2 books in 1 book? And so I was really confused. I didn't understand about, you know, God's old covenant. I just didn't know those things. I was never taught those things. As a Muslim, you're just not taught those things. So I look at it and I'm like, okay, I'll read it, but I just wanted to read it for fun, and I didn't want to read it to search out for truth or to look for God in any way. And so I went home that night and I read the whole Gospel of Matthew, and I took a piece of paper out and wrote every question I had down. If something didn't make sense, I wrote it down. And just about everything didn't make sense, so I wrote it down. I mean, I was like, who's this guy? What does apostle mean? What is a disciple? You know, like, why is baptism important? You know, why did Jesus get baptized? And so I would write all my questions down. And I was in journalism at the time, so I was definitely trained to ask questions. So I come back the next day with like a paper filled with questions, and I'm like, hey, can you answer these for me? So he's like, wow. So he was totally overwhelmed, and then he's like, why don't you email my wife and she can answer some questions for you? And so I took the email, and I didn't email her at first, but then I started emailing her once I started noticing that none of my questions could be answered in the amount of time that I had at school. So I started emailing his wife, and she was really good about explaining to me the history of certain books and the history of the churches that Paul was writing to, and it just started making much more sense when I started learning about these things. And she was even telling me like the history of the prophets' lives and stuff, and I asked questions. So I was reading like a book a night from the Bible until at one point, it was months later, I sat down in front of my dining room table and I asked myself what I was doing. What was I doing? I mean, I'm a Muslim. Like, Muslims don't even believe in the Bible. Like, we believe that it is corrupted. And so how could I read such a corrupt book? And I finally realized what I was reading. I mean, I had no idea, like, what I would find in the New Testament. But I found that God had sent his son down and died for the sins of his own people, that he was raised to life, which in turn conquers death so that we can be redeemed, so that we can be reconciled by God, with God. And so I finally understood what I was reading, and I understood what the intention of these books were. Like, there was a point why Paul wrote those letters. There's a point to those things. And so I sat down in disgust. I was very angry because I have read such a blasphemous book for so long. I mean, how can God become a man? How can he come in flesh? He's not his creation, you know? So I was thinking about all these things, and I was just like, wow, you know, no wonder I was never supposed to read this book. No wonder the Muslims tell me it's corrupted. Of course it's corrupted. How blasphemous is this, you know? And so I just sat there and discussed, and I realized that I had two options. I could either, one, at that point, give the Bible back and not deal with Christianity again and hold on to my Islamic beliefs, or I could either, two, continue to read the Bible, but I would definitely look at it differently. Because now I knew what it was saying. I knew that it was saying the message of salvation, like that it was claiming the message of salvation. And so I chose the second choice, and I said, I'm going to keep reading, but I'm not going to believe in this. I don't have to believe that, you know, God came down in the flesh. I don't have to believe that. All I have to do is acknowledge that this book is saying that. And that was a huge milestone for me, because once I acknowledged that, everything looked different. I looked at the Bible differently. I looked at it as it could be something that lives, something that is active, and something that claims to be the truth of the world. So it definitely changed my perception. And then I realized that something else needed to be changed. I needed to view the world as it were God's. I needed to view people as if God had created them. And so I started changing my perception of people. I was like, okay, no, they're really, you know, I really need to start paying more heed to the fact that this is God's creation. And once I did that, I started noticing things that I had never noticed before. And I started noticing just how certain things bugged me, like just how bad certain things bugged me. And so I would start noticing like just the sinful nature of human beings and my own sinful nature. And I would ask, you know, why did that just happen? Or why did this just happen? There was one day when I was sitting in my history class and we were watching a video of Hiroshima bombing. And my classmate from across the room starts laughing at the guy who's on the video. And the guy who's on the video